In May of 1994, Nintendo dropped more bad news with the announcement that Project Reality will continue to utilize cartridges instead of newer CD media that every other console had adopted. The reason giving behind this move? It would have made the system cost $100 more to produce. And I feel like we can make an entire episode about that because it's one thing to talk about the price of the console, but when you talk about the price of games, I mean, Nintendo, if like any savings or higher cost that you would have with consoles, you would have definitely saved on the consumer with the damn CDs because like the PS1 games were around 40 and 64 games were not that much. Now, Keith, you actually were the one to pull that quote. So what was interesting to you about it?
To me, that sounds like one of the biggest cop-outs in video game history, with them saying the reason for the console using cartridges was because it would have increased in cost for consumers. When you think about all of the positives and the negatives of CDs versus cartridges, it's almost like they just found one little sliver of something that they could twist as a positive and just went with that. Because you have to remember, when the N64 was in development, so was the PS1. And the Sega CD had been using CDs for years. So CDs were not like this brand new thing that we were just on the cusp of using as a society. They'd been around for a while, right? So all of the positives that you would get with a CD and the cost that the cartridges, that N64 cartridges ended up being, because yeah, you save $100 on the console itself, you buy 2 games, and boom, you just paid that $100 again back, no problem.
Yeah, you basically buy 2 games. It's like, hey, you made the difference.
Yeah, so it just seems like such a huge cop-out and a way for them to stay on their proprietary system that they were comfortable using, with cartridges being such a big part of the Super Nintendo. It's something that really shows that Nintendo hasn't changed at all since basically from between now and then, and that's that
you
quote
commend
is
them
a
for
gold
consistency,
example.
though.
That's true.
Because even when they switch to CDs, they couldn't just do normal ass CDs. They got to do tiny ones.
Yeah, I think they've always had this fear of piracy, and they've always wanted to go their own way. But if you do the breakdown, clearly this was one of the most impactful decisions about the Nintendo 64, and probably the biggest reason for potentially losing the console wars of this era. Because if we look at the breakdown, basically that a cartridge, N64 cartridge, could only hold 64 megabytes maximum compared to 650 megabytes on a CD, which is just an insane difference. You know, we talk about the, benefit of proprietary, cartridge, so that it's much harder for people to fake, although that's a much different story today. Less load times. There's a reasonable benefit right there, is you didn't really have load times on the N64, but it was at a pretty darn expensive cost, not only price-wise, but we see with the amount of space that could be held. So yeah, at the end of the day, clearly we see that CDs were probably the way that they should have gone.
Plus, I feel like it made Nintendo have a bit of a backstep out of the gate, because the decision to go with cartridges lost them one of the biggest IPs of the 90s, and arguably one of the biggest games ever in Final Fantasy/Final Fantasy VII, because up until that point, Final Fantasy was a Nintendo game, but because of the limitations that the cartridge created, Square was like, no, we're going to go over to PlayStation. See you later. So, like, even just before the system itself came out, they already put themselves on the back foot, and I just don't think they ever got on the front foot with that.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that's amazing, where you look at the Super Nintendo library, it was an RPG beast, but you compare that to N64, it's like, hey, Where did the RPGs go? You got
Let me
games
tell
with
you about
slight
Quest
elements.
64. Let's do a deep dive on Quest.
Okay, we could eventually do. But that game pissed me off so much. It was awful,
No,
but I
let's
tried to
not
convince
do
myself
that.
that it was good. But then, yeah, I think the shape of the actual cartridge is something that's very iconic. But you brought up an interesting point, Keith, which is it also makes it confusing for people because I remember reading a ton of articles. I was a kid at the time, didn't really think about that too much, where some parents would buy a Super Nintendo and they'd be like, hey, this NES cartridge, it doesn't fit in the thing. How come it's not backwards compatible? And then you're yet increasing that challenge with the N64. And I mean, that's where the infamous, like, you blow the cartridge, which people, you should not, they literally tell you to not blow on the cartridge. Did you guys ever blow on an N64 cartridge?
It works. I'm telling you, man.
Yeah,
it works.
it works. Maybe they say
But they
not
tell
to
us
do
not
it.
to, though. They tell us
I
not to.
understand that, but when you're everybody had that one game, right? The one that would only work like 1 in every 10 times that you turn the system on. You blow on it a few times and boom, it magically works. I don't think that's a coincidence.
Okay, I got a question for you guys. Popping in a game, it not working, and then you got to putting it out and back in. Is that a fault or a feature of the console? We're talking about nostalgia. I mean, you can't have N64 nostalgia without a game working or not working the first time.
It's true. I mean, once, like, that was a game before the game, Once
that was the mini game.
You were so happy. Yeah, it was like a mini game.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the N64 cartridge is probably the worst cartridge ever because it didn't have an end label or anything. So putting it on your shelf was super. I don't know what they were thinking. Like Super Nintendo, NES, you could figure out what game it was, but N64, just a terrible decision.
Hey friends, we hope you enjoyed this podcast clip. And if you did, the full adventure begins on Sunday, October 17th. So you can follow us on Spotify or your favorite podcast app by searching for Quest Rewind. And if you watch this clip after that date, then guess what? You can listen to the full episode right now.